A fourth round of JCPOA talks resumed in Vienna Friday. On its eve, that's May the 6th, Press TV learned US and European signatories to the deal are seeking the destruction of Iran's new generation centrifuges in return for a temporary suspension of some of the sanctions related to the nuclear deal, or JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that is. Whereas, by way of the JCPOA, Iran's advanced centrifuges, including IR4, IR6 and IR9 centrifuges, must only be stored away under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and not destroyed. To Press TV, it's been crystal clear from the onset that the US is steadfast on its stance, which explains our early prediction that the Vienna talks were not going to produce some miracle fruit in record time. The fruit being the revival of the JCPOA by the US re-entering that deal and Iran recommitting to it. Contrary to the nature of talks, both parties came in with pretty fixed demands, and each expecting the other to take the first step or make the first concession. But it was only one party that pulled out of the deal. That was the USA on 8th May 2018. And so, for talks to become as hopeful as positive comments by delegates to Vienna, perhaps the guilty party will have to make some concessions for its crime. For more on where talks are headed and when, stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today. Iran's partners to the deal would like to get results before this country's mid-June presidential elections, and preferably even before that, because an ad hoc agreement struck between Iran and the UN nuclear inspectors ends on 21st May. And if that is not renewed, the UN will have little effective access to Iran's nuclear sites. To Iran, the time frame and a US return to the deal don't matter so much as sanctions relief. Now, how easy that will be given the many knots former US President Trump created in the chain of sanctions, our guest will comment on. Mr. Khoshcheshm is a political expert of current affairs. He joined us by Skype.
It's more a matter of political will by Washington, because the US is not willing to resolve the conflict with Iran. The US strategy has never been a strategy based on conflict resolution, but it's always been a strategy based on containment. So in this framework, the US feels that it needs the sanctions structure, so they try hard to keep as many sanctions as possible and to keep the sanctions structure intact.
The nuclear deal was signed in 2015 between Iran and the P5+1. That's the US, UK, France, Russia and China, plus Germany. It was to lift nuclear-related economic UN sanctions off this country, in return for Iran limiting its nuclear program, which it has maintained as peaceful all along. Iran complied, as verified 15 times, no less, by the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA. But instead of seeing foreign trade open up to it, Iran saw 3 years of its economy slipping down the road to higher inflation and a lowered value to its currency. And finally, Trump's USA just backed out of the deal in 2018 on May the 8th. Hence, Iran started reversibly scaling back its nuclear commitments on the anniversary of that day. Mr. Zahed is a university professor specializing in history and involved in media work. We got to visit him at the Ministry of Cooperatives, Labor and Social Welfare.
It's a very complicated situation caused by the withdrawal of Trump's administration from the JCPOA. His decision to leave the deal actually has created many problems for both sides, especially for Iran and the EU members of the JCPOA. We were under heavy economic pressure, especially the ordinary people of Iran. Trump's administration believed that the Iranian government will not cease for this anniversary, so they unleashed a maximum pressure campaign against the people of Iran, hoping that the Iranian government will collapse in few months. However, it proved otherwise. We persisted until Trump's political life came to an end.
Having installed more advanced centrifuges is a continuation of Iran's pressure strategy, which was to get Western European parties to the deal to find a way around US sanctions. This goes to show the Europeans didn't succeed or didn't want to succeed. Today, they appear in a rush to get results from the Vienna talks to revive the JCPOA. Question is, do they have the clout to make that happen? Mr. Abedin is a Press TV political analyst. He puts the Vienna talks in context with a look at recent Press TV coverage. What might be Europe's role in sanction lifting and the revival of the JCPOA?
Well, I'm very skeptical about any European role in any big international affair. The European powers are quite toothless, let's face it. And in relation specifically to the JCPOA, they were absolutely toothless because the Americans violated that deal 3 years ago. Europe did absolutely nothing. In fact, Europe tried to do America's bidding by applying pressure on Iran. And they're playing the same spoiler role again. So you know, I personally, as an expert on this issue, I don't attach too much weight to the European powers. I think for me, the more important partners here are Russia and China.
That's why Iran has been paying almost undivided attention to the East. Where the West failed, perhaps Russia and China can do their part in positively concluding talks and perking up the JCPOA. How effective do you think Russia and China might be actually in the JCPOA revival, sanction lifting, basically?
Unlike Europe, unlike the three European powers, the UK, France and Germany, Russia and China actually have real leverage with the United States. Yeah, there are so many international issues which the US gets connected to Russia and China. Think about Ukraine, think about Crimea, think about energy supplies to Europe, think about Taiwan, think about Hong Kong, think about all the frictions in US-China trade. So US has a lot to worry about in relation to China and Russia. They have leverage over the US, the European powers do not. And of course, Iran is on friendly terms with both Russia and China, so potentially they could provide a good mediating role, especially in terms of stabilizing the deal once the Americans go back into compliance, once they lift all the sanctions.
A country like Iran with nuclear power and ability for enrichment is not as strategically favored by Russia. Russia has been known to withdraw its support last minute. But after all, this country also needs peace in the region. And also I think that in real politics, countries cooperate based on common interests. And surely Iran and Russia have numerous benefits in common. So there is a hope that this time Russia will remain on Iran's side.
I asked for a comment on that comment that Russia has been known to withdraw its support last minute. Might it do so now, and how fatal would that be in the case of the JCPOA?
The Russians are obviously have their own set of national interests, but in terms of the JCPOA, Russia is in favor of it, as far as we know, and Russia wants to reseal the deal. They want the Americans to go back into the deal, and Russia wants these sanctions lifted. So I don't envisage a spoiler role for Russia in this issue.
Be it by Russo-Chinese efforts or its own will, let's imagine the USA back in the deal. Why will it have gotten back? Plenty more questions and answers lined up, but first a quick review of other media outlets. And here's how it looks on the screen. Tehran Times quotes a senior Iranian MP warning delegates from this country not to fall into a trap. Vienna talks to lead to a new deal, warns the MP. A senior Iranian lawmaker has said that the Vienna nuclear talks between Iran and world powers are expected to lead to a new deal, warning the Iranian negotiating team against falling into the American trap. The lawmaker, Alireza Salimi, who is member of the parliament's presiding board, said the Vienna talks should proceed within the framework of a nuclear law passed by parliament and in accordance with the policies articulated by the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. The nuclear law, officially called Strategic Action to Lift Sanctions and Protect the Nation's Rights, stipulates that if the remaining parties to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, Germany, France, China, Russia and the UK, failed to facilitate Iran's oil exports and the return of Iranian oil revenues in 2 months from the date the law passed in Majlis, the Iranian government would be obligated to stop inspections beyond the IAEA safeguards, including the voluntary implementation of the additional protocol, which allows unannounced and intensive inspections of nuclear sites. Mer News quotes the importance of deadlines, hard as they might be to meet. Risk of Vienna talks to increase after May the 21st, says Ulyanov. Russia's permanent representative to the international organizations in Vienna, Mikhail Ulyanov, in a tweet on Sunday, warned that continuation of nuclear talks in Vienna will be intensified after May the 21st, and continuation of negotiations after May 21st and end of Iran's 3-month cooperation agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency will face more uncertainty and risks. We have initiated the 4 rounds of the Vienna talks to bring the JCPOA back to life, said Deputy of European Union Foreign Policy Chief Enrique Mora, who runs the Vienna talks. No deadlines, but as a coordinator, I feel a certain sense of urgency. Time is not on our side. Happy to see that all delegations, including Iran and the US, say they share that sense. Ulyanov quoted Deputy EU Foreign Policy Chief Enrique Mora's tweet on May the 8th. The Financial Tribune takes note of parties' sense of urgency. JCPOA members agree to expedite restoration process. 3 expert groups have been set up to work on the sanctions lifting and nuclear implementation measures and the sequence of the steps to be taken by each side. Deputy Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, who had arrived in Vienna Thursday, May the 6th, to head the Iranian delegation, held bilateral discussions with Mora ahead of the meeting. He had also met with Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, on Thursday evening. Hard work is ahead of us, and we hope to get a result as soon as possible. But time is a second priority, Araghchi told reporters following his meeting with Grossi. The first priority is care to advance the Iranian nation's interests and ensure the Islamic Republic's explicit demands are met. He said the Iranian delegation will avoid a rush, which could negatively affect the thoroughness of their negotiations, but will not allow the talks to be dragged out for too long either. That'll be it for the news segment, but plenty more of our narrative, so do stay tuned. Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. Envisaging the day problems are resolved, what would be America's motive for getting Iran and itself recommitted and re-entered into the deal? Perhaps it would simply be to waste more of Iran's time and lure it into signing another deal, a JCPOA 2 or JCPOA Plus.
The U.S. needs multiple agreements. It needs the JCPOA as a platform. Once it gets through with this JCPOA, definitely it asks, as Mr. Biden has already acknowledged, they would ask for step 2 of the JCPOA in order to ensure that Iran's nuclear capabilities have been contained and the growth in this area has fully stopped. And then they would go for rolling it back. But that's not the end. Then they move on to the missile industry and then the regional power, and then God knows when they would stop asking for excessive demands. As long as the strategy is the same, we shouldn't expect the U.S. to stop its excessive demands. That's the purpose, and that's the objective of this strategy.
President Biden has pledged to rejoin the nuclear accord. That was, in fact, even one of his keynote presidential winning points. But he has also called for negotiating a longer and stronger deal afterwards to curb Iran's missile program and its support for freedom movements in places such as Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Fit for presidency and dignified as Joe Biden might be, in contrast to his predecessor, that is exactly why Iran suspects getting into another understanding with the US. Although, in a tweet on the latest meeting, Russian Representative Mikhail Ulyanov confirmed the JCPOA's Joint Commission opened a new round of talks on full restoration of the nuclear deal. So anything else would have to follow rather than modify and sully the present deal. Also, US officials have implied any follow-up deal will upgrade to secure mutual interests with Iran. Problem is, Iran has already suffered irreparable destruction to its economy and nuclear program exactly because of a deal that was abused by the flag bearers. And so leveling out the playing field now will not level and even out the two sides situation and standing. The two sides being Iran versus the US or Iran versus all its JCPOA partners even. We know Westerners see their interests or Israel's interest in scrapping Iran's ballistic missile program and limiting its regional influence. And so they want a JCPOA plus. But Iran will not deliberately disarm itself of basic defenses it has the capability of producing domestically. Also, the region of West Asia is Iran's native neighborhood. Iranians are one of the oldest prominent tribes here, collectively speaking.
Of course, Iran has on many occasions repeatedly said it's not going to negotiate a JCPOA plus. There's not going to be any additional features to this. No one's going to discuss Iran's regional role. Nobody's going to discuss Iran's national defense capabilities, our ballistic missile capability, and the rest. These are taboos. These are red lines. They're never ever going to be discussed with foreign entities under any situation or any condition.
The Vienna talks stretched out long enough to meet the third anniversary of the US pullout from the deal. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif made a note of that on Sunday, May the 8th, in order to direct efforts. He tweeted, "While we are collectively spending efforts to revive the JCPOA in Vienna, it is necessary to remember how this problem began. Trump's USA was governed like a circus, and it breached US commitment to UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which the JCPOA rests on." And so, Minister Zarif stressed that US President Joe Biden must now decide whether the United States wishes to continue breaking laws or to be committed to the laws. It is America that needs to accept its responsibilities, not Iran.
After Trump's presidential term came to an end and Biden took over, conditions have changed for both sides. During this presidential campaign, Biden had mentioned that he would return to the JCPOA. On this side of the table, the Iranian government welcomes any attempt that can improve the current unappealing economic situation in the country. All this has led to the negotiations in Vienna, which I believe is promising.
It may sound too obvious to state, but not everyone can or will see the obvious without constant repetition. The Zarif tweet was provoked by words such as US officials actually saying that reviving the nuclear deal is possible if Iran makes a political decision, to which Iran says it is up to President Joe Biden to make a decision. After all, it was his country that trashed the deal to begin with, triggering an avalanche and then the Vienna talks to put it all right. Frankly, the US itself needs the JCPOA or it wouldn't have signed it under former President Barack Obama, to whom Joe Biden was vice president.
From an American point of view, this deal created stability. If they're really worried about Iran's nuclear program, then this deal, it addressed their worries. Of course, from our point of view, there's absolutely nothing to worry about because Iran only has a civilian nuclear program. We have a right to nuclear enrichment. We're willing to suspend that right for a specified period, 5, 10 years, whatever the deal specifies, in order to create goodwill from the other side. But from our point of view, we couldn't be more clear. We have a right to enrich uranium to whatever level we want, because we know what we're doing it for. It's for civilian purposes. It's for our energy needs. It's for our medical needs, related needs. Now, if the other side feels that this is a worry for them, fine, we can enter into a deal with them. But we have to get the economic benefit of that immediately.
US officials are centering too much on the ifs of Iran's commitment when Iran has actually left no room for confusion. To me, the message seems pretty clear when Iran says it will. It will, without a shadow of a doubt, recommit to the letter of the JCPOA if and when the US verifiably and reliably lifts all sanctions off this country. Iran was committed when it was all Western parties to the deal that let this country and the deal down. Tens of times. At least the US broke its promises tens of times, Iran's leader of the revolution noted in cautioning, "Sanctions must be removed first. Once we are certain that has been done, we will carry out our commitments. The US is not after accepting the truth through negotiations. Rather, it seeks to impose its false words." The Europeans have also confessed in some private meetings with our officials that Iran is in the right, and they acknowledge our policy that sanctions must be removed first. Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei continued.
So this time, it needs Tehran to verify anything that's undertaken by the United States between 3 to 6 months. For example, when it comes to the oil sector, foreign customers should order supplies, and then Iran should be free to send whatever supply it wants, energy supplies, to its customers, especially those in Asia, like the Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Indians, and then they should send and wire the money back to Iran, and Iran should receive it freely and be free to do whatever it wants with this money.
The leader's declaration came 3 days after an explosive blast at the Natanz enrichment site, which plunged the facility into a blackout and disabled or destroyed hundreds of underground centrifuges used to process uranium into fuel. This sabotage by Israel and maybe partners set Iran vowing to triple its uranium enrichment purity to 60% purity levels. But it did not succeed in hampering the Vienna talks. Iran is determined to wait for results if partners want to produce them. Joe Biden faces a lot of pressure at home for re-entering the deal by lifting sanctions off Iran. But the US's domestic problems don't concern this country, and Iran is looking to secure guarantees Biden will remain committed to the deal if he re-enters for the full term of his presidency. Because come 2024, Republicans may well take the reins of power again in America.
One of the red lines of Iran's negotiating position, and this is very important, is that Iran has rejected a step-for-step process. Now, this is not to be confused with a step-by-step. Now, if the Americans want to lift sanctions step-by-step, fine. They shouldn't expect any moves from Iran. They can just lift them slowly. Once they've been lifted verifiably, Iran will go back into full compliance. But what is an absolute no-no is a step-for-step. So they take one step, we take one step. That's been rejected out of hand.
There are some individuals and also groups inside the country who seem to be unsatisfied with the results of the negotiations. But on the other hand, outside of the country, there are many opposing voices here and there. Countries such as Saudi Arabia are worried, and we know that the Israeli regime is doing its best to deviate the negotiations between Iran and the P4+1 from its current path. Also, hardliners, Republicans, and the Tea Party in the US are extremely against any agreements and lifting of sanctions.
For all parties, it's best at this point to make the most of intermediaries and wise men. That's been the intention, and negotiations have been held both at the level of experts and within the working group set up in the previous rounds of the talks in Vienna. Whatever the results now, the JCPOA Commission will reconvene whenever it is necessary.
Well, I think we can safely say the situation is still unclear. Sometimes one party comes and says a deal can be struck within a few weeks or is within reach, and then the spokesperson for the American State Department comes and says completely different, pours cold water on that. So quite frankly, I think we're not getting a sufficient amount of clear information.
Previously, Iranian officials had reported progress in the talks. They said the two sides had agreed that the US would lift sanctions on Iran's energy and banking sectors, which are JCPOA related, in contrast to the 2019 sanctions on persons and entities the US deems terrorist. But what the US agreed was not enough to satisfy the Iranian officials. Iran continues to maintain the US pulled out of the agreement and should therefore lift all economic sanctions before Iran takes any steps to return to compliance with the JCPOA. That's it for today, but there's plenty more coming up, as nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And it won't be easy, as Iran won't accept any new nuclear demands. Do return to the box at the same times next week and each week after for Press TV's analyses and realistic predictions. Thanks for watching from the whole team, and bye for now.